Hi. If you are watching, this lesson is for week two. And we are going to go over one of my favorite stories, which just happens to be King Midas and the Golden Touch. Most kids are pretty familiar with this story. What we're going to talk about today, that's different about this story, especially um, considering what this is about. This is about greed. Um, when King Midas is granted a wish of anything he wants, he's already a wealthy king. He already has everything he could possibly want. So, what his wish is that everything he touches turns to gold really shows his heart. What does he value most? And I think we can all agree if you value things over people, then something's a little bit messed up in your priorities. So he has three things in his life, and I'm going to give you the order that he values them. Number one is gold. Number two is his rose garden, and number three is his daughter. So what happens when we are consumed by one of the seven deadly sins, which greed is number two? The only thing worse is pride. Is our thinking is skewed, our judgment is off. So if you look through your packet, you will notice I've given you on page 2 the definition of greed. A selfish and excessive desire for more of something than is needed. It says such as money. It can be greed for food. It can be greed for power, for fame. And in this case, the avarice, that's a fancy word for greed, was wealth. So think about this. This is a story told over 2,000 years ago. So this is part of folklore. So this story has been passed down from generation to generation. And because it's so famous, the phrase the Midas touch means someone has good fortune. Everything they touch just makes them wealthy. Comes from this story. But this Greek myth is a tragedy. It explains what happens when someone places more importance on things in this world to the exclusion of all else. When Midas wished that everything he touched would turn into gold, he kind of made a mistake. I mean, logically, what could be wrong with that? Well, once his wish is granted and everything he touches starts turning into gold, he's super happy until he tries to eat, right? I think you can see what he considered a blessing has become a curse. If you know anything about food and drink, you can survive for weeks without food, actually. You can survive maybe 3 days without water. So if everything he touches turns to gold, he can't eat or drink. So what does that mean? It means he's going to die. And he's filled with fear. So that's kind of the moment, the climax of the story, the epiphany, if you will, when he realizes, uh-oh, the foolishness of my request. Really doesn't ask that the wish be taken away at that point. It's only at the end when he hugs his daughter and she turns into gold that he requests the wish to be taken back. He asks the wish to be taken back. So a kind of nice ending. It kind of tells us that we do know, as flawed as he is, his priorities are in the right place. Okay, so what we're going to do today with this very popular myth is we're going to read two different interpretations. That's right, two. The basic premise of the story will remain unchanged. And there are fine tunings, variations, modifications. And this is because Greek myths are a part of folklore and because they're retold. Maybe they're modernized a little bit in the next generation. What you're going to do is you're going to compare and contrast how they're alike and how they're similar. And what I'm going to tell you is this week, last week, I asked students, well, did you like this? Which one did you like better? And I'm going to be really honest with you. I really liked the ending of one of them more than the other. I liked the portrayal of King Midas in one more than the other. And I wish I could merge the two stories together, but that's not how retellings go. So why are we comparing and contrasting the story? One version offers, a resolution, but we really don't know what happened. While the other story really, we see a change of heart. We see someone who's excessively greedy and selfish, um, really change. This, experience caused him to be a better king. So obviously, I kind of prefer that one. But the theme here, the message is couple, um, be careful what you wish for. And I think for me, when you put wealth, when you put when you're not grateful for what you have, and when you want more, just maybe your downfall. And that's a timeless tale, really, because we in this culture today in 2024, we can get stuck in this idea that the more we have, the better. That wealth buys happiness, and that's just not true, as the story will tell you. Okay, so if you could follow along the first story, by the way, they're not long, they're about a page long. The first one is retelling number one. Here we go. Once upon a time, a long time ago in ancient Greece, there lived a king named Midas. King Midas loved three things more than anything else in the world: his little daughter, his rose garden, and gold. Nothing gave him more pleasure than seeing his little daughter picking roses in the garden. Roses she placed in a golden vase to decorate the castle. One night, while strolling through his rose garden, the king stumbled over a satyr. A satyr was half man, half goat. This satyr looked half starved and very ill. King Midas brought the satyr into his castle. He made sure the satyr was washed and fed and tucked to bed for a good night's sleep. When the satyr woke up the next morning, his fever was gone. The king and the satyr had quite a nice chat over breakfast. King Midas was surprised to hear that the satyr belonged to the powerful god Dionysus, the god of wine and truth. That very day, the king personally took the satyr home in his very best chariot. The satyr might only be a servant, but he was the servant of a god and deserved the very best treatment, which is something the king would have done anyway, because the king had a very kind heart. As it turned out, the satyr was more than a servant. To Dionysus, the satyr was his teacher and good friend. Dionysus told the king he would grant one wish, excuse me, the king made to thank him for taking such good care of his friend. The king did not wish anything for his daughter because he'd given her everything she wanted and a whole bunch more besides. He did not wish anything for his rose garden because everyone knew he grew the finest roses in all the world. That left gold. King Midas wished that everything he touched would turn to gold. The king did not have much hope that his wish had been granted, because if it had been granted, his chariot would have been turned to gold when he climbed aboard to go home, and it had not. Still, he was happy he had helped the satyr, and not just because the satyr was the servant of a god. Satyrs were not always treated kindly in the ancient Greek world because they looked rather different, being half man and half goat. When the king arrived back at his castle, he pulled out a chair to sit down at his table. The minute he touched it, the chair turned to gold. He touched the table. He touched a vase. As soon as he touched them, they turned to gold. King Midas raced through his castle. Everything he touched turned to gold. He was so happy. He shouted to his servants to cook him a feast in celebration. His servants were very fond of King Midas. They knew he was foolish, but he was rather a dear. So they cooked and served him a feast. That's when the trouble started. Everything looked and smelled so good that King Midas did not wait for his daughter to show up for lunch. He reached out and grabbed a fistful of food. The food made quite a clatter when he dropped it back on the table in shock. It had turned to gold in his fist. He touched other food. Whatever he touched turned to gold. He tried to lean over and rip a piece of meat with his teeth. I love that part. But that did not help. The meat turned to gold in his mouth. The king's eyes filled with fear. He knew that if he could not eat, he would starve. This was terrible. The king did not know what to do. King Midas wandered sadly out to his rose garden. His little daughter was in the garden picking roses. When she saw her father, she ran into his arms for a hug and turned to gold. King Midas hung his head and cried. As his tears fell on his precious roses, they turned to gold. But the king did not care. He did not care about his roses or his gold or himself. Dionysus, hear my prayer, the king begged. Take my wish back. Please take my wish back and save my daughter. One last time, the king's wish was granted. Okay, so here's what I want you to really be looking out for. I'm going to tell you right now the similarities. Both stories have a king who's somewhat greedy. You don't wish for everything you touch to be turned to gold if you're not greedy. So it's a foolish wish, especially because they're both already wealthy. They already have all they could want, right? In both stories, they encounter a satyr. They help the satyr out in some way, okay? In both stories, they feel fear, this realization that their wish was pretty foolish when they try to eat and drink. And they realize this might be the end. And in both stories, they don't ask for the wish to be taken back when it's their life, only when their daughter turns to gold. And it's in a different place in both stories and in a different way. But they both have this moment where they're like, no, not my daughter. Please take the wish back. And the wish is taken back in both stories. What I want you to listen for are the differences. And I'm going to stop and start in this retelling and kind of go over those with you. Retelling number 2. Same story. Midas was a king of great fortune who ruled the country of Phrygia in Asia Minor. Phrygians was the first Greek myth this month, Baucis and Philemon. He had everything a king could wish for. He lived in luxury in a great castle. He shared his life of abundance with his beautiful daughter. Even though he was very rich, Midas thought that his greatest happiness was provided by gold. First priority, gold. His avarice was such, I love this part. He used to spend his days counting his golden coins. Occasionally, he used to cover his body with gold objects as if he wanted to bathe in them. Money was his obsession. Okay, we've got a different portrayal here. The other guy was just kind of like, yeah, I like nice things. He's a little bit more obsessive here, right? The other guy seemed a little bit nicer, right? One day, Dionysus, the god of wine and revelry, passed through the kingdom of Midas. One of his companions, a satyr named Silenus, whenever you name somebody, they're important, got delayed along the way. Silenus got tired and decided to take a nap in the famous rose garden surrounding the palace of King Midas. There he was found by the king, who recognized him instantly and invited him to spend a few days at his palace. Okay, so a little bit different here. In the first story, King Midas comes across a very sick and half-starved satyr, nurses it back to health. So compassionate, it kind of shows his heart. This guy knows this is the satyr companion of the god Dionysus. And he invites him to party with him. And after that, Midas took him to Dionysus, probably knowing he would get a wish. Because when you help out a god, right, they reward you. The god of celebration, very grateful to Midas for his kindness, promised Midas to satisfy any wish of him. Dionysus warned the king. Midas thought for a while, and then he said, I hope that everything I touch becomes gold. So this is a variation. Dionysus warned the king to think well about his wish. You know, that's kind of a warning. When a god warns you, you should probably go, wait, maybe I should take that to heart. But Midas was positive. Dionysus could do nothing else and promised the king that from the following day, everything he touched would turn into gold. So this is different. The first story, when the King Midas returned to his castle that same day, as soon as he entered his own castle, everything he touched turned to gold. He's telling him, wait till the next day. So the next day, Midas woke up eager to see if his wish would become true. He extended his arm, touching a small table that immediately turned into gold. Midas jumped with happiness. He then touched a chair, the carpet, the door, his bathtub, a table, and so he kept on running in his madness all over his palace until he got exhausted and happy at the same time. He sat at the table to have breakfast and took a rose between his hands to smell its fragrance. When he touched it, the rose became gold. I will have to absorb the fragrance without touching the roses, I suppose, he thought in disappointment. Without even thinking, he ate a grape, but it also turned into gold. The same thing happened with a slice of bread and a glass of water. Suddenly, he started to sense fear. Now, remember, he's in the breakfast room, right? In the previous story, he walked outside to his rose garden. He was very upset, and his daughter ran up to him, and he hugged her and turned to gold. So that was in the rose garden. So this is going to be different here. Tears filled his eyes, and at that moment, his beloved daughter entered the room. So breakfast room, dining room. When Midas hugged her, she turned into a golden statue. Despaired and fearful, he raised his arms and prayed to Dionysus to take this curse from him. So that was the same in both stories. The god heard Midas and felt sorry for him, but he didn't take back the wish right away, like the first story. He told Midas to go to River Pactolus and wash his hands. Midas did so. He ran to the river and was astonished to see gold flowing from his hands. The ancient Greeks said they'd found gold on the banks of the river Pactolus. What does this mean, to wash your hands? In many religions, it's cleansing. It is cleansing, let's be real. In this story, it's a symbol for atoning. To atone is basically to try to make it right. Make your mistake or your sin or whatever you did wrong, make it right. So he made him do something first. So basically, he had to say he was sorry. This was his way to say he was sorry. When he returned home, everything Midas had touched had become normal again. Midas hugged his daughter in full happiness and decided to share his great fortune with his people. From then on, Midas became a better person, generous and grateful for all goods of his life. Okay, this is the same king at the beginning of the story that would cover his body with gold objects as if he wanted to bathe in them. He was so obsessed with money. And he's had a complete change of heart. His people led a prosperous life, and when he died, they mourned for him. He was not portrayed nicely at the beginning, but he had a complete 180, complete change of heart. So if you'll notice on page 4, I've given you similarities and differences. There are a lot more differences because you kind of have to do them side by side. What you want to do is show in body 1 of your outline. Here's what we're going to prove today. The Greek myth, the Midas touch, has been translated in 2 retellings, where even though the main idea and theme of the story is the same, specific changes made to the story offer enjoyable differences. So the 2 stories of the Midas touch have similarities which make them sound the same. And obviously the first one was how they portrayed the king as greedy. And they tell you right away he's greedy. One of them explains it a little bit more in detail than the other. But let's be honest, the wish shows his greed. He didn't wish to be happy. He didn't wish to be protected. He didn't wish for wisdom. He wished for everything he touched turned to gold. So it was foolish, which kind of shows his priorities were out of whack. That was the same in both stories. The climax of the story is when he eats and drinks. This is when you really know, didn't think that wish through. Here's the thing. In both stories, he is fearful, and rightly so. I actually like the first story where he's like eating it with his teeth, trying to pick it up. No, he's going to die. And he had to have that realization. I'm going to die if I can't eat, right? There's no way. But what's really interesting in both stories, he didn't ask for the wish to be taken back when it was his life. So he's starting to change here. The really culmination point here, and I think really the point where he asked the god Dionysus to take the wish back, which shows he recognized his folly, was when his daughter turned to gold in both stories. Didn't matter if it was in the rose garden or the breakfast room, which we'll do in the next paragraph. What mattered was, as soon as he hugged her and she turned to gold, he realized, oh, it's not worth this. Nothing is worth my daughter's life. So maybe his priorities were out of whack, and maybe this situation really brought to light that he was too greedy. That was shown in both stories. How were they different? Well, the encounter with the satyr, in the first story, he's compassionate. He nurses this sick satyr back to health, really not knowing that it's the god Dionysus's companion. He doesn't know that. He's just doing it out of the goodness of his heart. In the other story, though, he knows the satyr, Silenus, is the companion of the god Dionysus, and he knows if he does the satyr a favor, he'll probably get a wish. So it's a little bit more manipulative. It's a little bit more uh, sinister. I don't know if I want to say sinister, planned. Yeah. Um, The second really big change, and you don't have to do this one, there are lots of differences in the story. You can choose any three. You don't have to choose mine in the differences. The similarities, you need to choose mine. The differences, there are more than three. Another difference in the story was when they could turn things into gold. And so the first story, he didn't really care. He's like, oh, well, I'm riding in my chariot home and nothing's turned to gold. Oh, well, don't really care. If it happens, fine. If it doesn't, fine. He's not so obsessed. But it does happen as soon as he gets to his own castle. In the second story, he's like, when's it gonna happen? And the god Dionysus is like, you sure you want to wish this? Yeah, I'm sure. And he can't wait. He wakes up that next morning knowing this is the day, right? It's like your birthday. Um, that's different. When they eat, the first story, it's just massive feast, right? And it's really interesting. In the second story, it's a grape, bread, and water, right? A little variation there. In the first story, the hug is in the rose garden, right? When his daughter turns to gold. And he cries out, Dionysus, hear my prayer, please take this wish back. And instantly done, which didn't really care for that ending. Love the other stuff in there. But in the second story, it's the breakfast room, right? The rose thing happens, he smells the rose. That's a little different. There was no kind of rose smelling in the first story. But the daughter comes into the breakfast room and turns into a golden statue. And this time it's not so simple. You don't just get to wish, take back. You got to go wash your hands in the river Pactolus and atone. Say you're sorry. Then I'll take that wish back. So when there are two translations of a popular story, these slight alterations allow for interesting perspectives, yet still deliver the same message. So this is a compare contrast. I didn't give you all the differences. I gave you a couple, so you can. And I always like when students find different variations. I will tell you, when you're giving your backups, where it says explain in 2, 4, and 6, I don't want just one sentence. You really need to have 3 sentences at least to back up each point. So make sure you are elaborating and doing that. Going to that, yeah. And making sure that you're doing that. On the back is an example. It says golden curse. I kind of gave golden away. Please don't put King Midas and the golden touch. Really downgrades you in an English class. English teachers are looking for creative titles, usually that say the theme. So probably a better title than Golden Curse would have been, trying to think, Foolish Mistake, right? Anything that would kind of tell the theme. Notice they're equally weighted. The difference is going to probably be a little bit longer, so you're going to have to add more details to the similarities. All right. This concludes King Midas and the Golden Touch, October lesson 2, and thank you for watching.